Hi, I'm Sarah Riordan. I'm here at USB Ed, We Read For You. This morning I reviewed a book by Jacob Morgan, The Employee Experience Advantage, a really interesting take on how we advance the discussion from employee engagement to employee experience. Good morning everybody, and thank you very much for coming to join us this morning. I was thinking about why I agreed to read this book. When I was first invited to review it, I was, of course, interested and curious about this whole notion of employee experience because that is within my field. But I was also a little wary because I think many of us are exposed to fads and to the latest buzzwords that might be going around in the industry. So I think I approached the whole exercise with an open mind. My background is organizational psychology, so I'm genuinely interested in the relationship that people have with work and what work does for us and our identity. And so it's with that kind of background that I approached this invitation. And overall, I think you'll find that what we learn from Jacob Morgan is refreshing in some contexts. I mean, there's definitely some new thoughts, but there will also be things that you will recognize from other authors and from other iterations. So I hope that I can summarize in a reasonably short time a fairly dense and data-rich text. That's what I'm going to try and do. So on behalf of you, it was a pleasure to read this book. And he starts off with the introduction, just by saying that we all care about experiences. And there's plenty of research which indicates that over time, people who spend money on experiences rather than physical goods actually have higher general satisfaction. People that spend more time waiting for an experience than a physical good are happier in the long run. And similarly, we spend money on experiences and derive more satisfaction from that than from physical goods. And this is largely because the experiences reflect our identity. They help us shape memories, they help us build lasting relationships, and they help us make connections with others. He makes the point in the introduction that humans are taking over jobs from robots. So I don't have that in the wrong way around. That's what he says. And it's quite an interesting take on the notion because everyone's talking at the moment about, the robots are coming and it's fourth industrial revolution and so on. But he argues quite strongly that we have designed organizations up until now for people to do things in a repetitive, monotonous way, to all think along the same lines, to all go to our little cubicles in the morning and to exercise whatever it is we're supposed to be doing. And then in actual fact, we've designed organizations for robots and then just populated them with humans. And what he argues now is that the inverse is in fact true, and now we should be designing organizations for humans, which requires us to take more cognizance of their overall experience. So he ends the introduction by saying that we must design organizations for people who want to be there and not make the assumption that they need to be there. So the book is divided into 4 distinct parts, and I'm going to try and get through all of them with you. Briefly, just how we got to this notion of employee experience. And I will be referring to it as EE in this presentation. So it's not employment equity in the South African context, it's the employee experience. I will refer to EE. The reason for being and the 3 employee environments, and that's a very important, that's the crux of the model. Then why you should invest in it, why should you bother, and what you should do to go about trying to do this in your organization. So just as far as the evolution is concerned, you will recall, I'm sure, all of you that have read literature in the past, that we originally had quite a utilitarian approach towards people. We need people at work and they must be provided with the basic tools to do the job. They're a cog in a wheel, and we're only really concerned about people insofar as they can effect whatever task we give them. Then we moved on to the productivity phase, or the productivity era, where there was a lot of time and motion studies about how to make people work faster, how to break the job down into small parts. And that's where we got the assembly line. That's where we got a lot of repetitious work. You might remember Frank and Lillian Gilbreth were authors in that field. They had 13 children, so they got a lot of things right around time and motion study. Then we move on to the period of engagement, employee engagement, and that's where a lot of us still are. We think about employee engagement. And that has a lot to do with how to make the work environment more pleasant, how to make people more motivated, how to encourage them to appreciate the culture in the organization, to have a culture that works for them. Now, this is where Jacob Morgan makes the big distinction, because he says we're not getting rid of engagement, But he argues that engagement is like an adrenaline shot where you try and introduce something that makes people feel happier about being at work. But in actual fact, what we should do is redesign the whole work experience. And if we redesign the experience properly, then engagement will naturally follow. So this isn't replacing engagement, it's saying there's actually another step where you step back and think more carefully about the overall experience. And then we will, as an outcome, have engaged employees. So he uses the analogy of an old car, where he says if you buy an old car and you just paint it, that would be engagement. But if you buy an old car and replace the engine, that would be employee experience. So we start thinking about redesigning the whole organization. He makes the point that there are obviously multiple sides to this. We can look at this from the organizational perspective, we can look at it from the employee perspective, but essentially we're trying to find a blended approach which accommodates both perspectives. So throughout the book, he justifies or he defends or rationalizes every statement. He backs them up with quite comprehensive peer-reviewed academic studies. So I'm not going to relay all the studies to you, but if I state something as a fact, you can be sure that in the book there's a study that backs it up. So how did he gather the data? He embarked upon this exercise by interviewing many, many people, CEOs of many large companies, senior HR executives, a number of individuals. He also reviewed 150 desktop studies, so academic studies, and he then conducted active research in 252 companies. He narrowed this all down to sort of through pattern analysis. So for those of you that know about thematic analysis in research, he narrowed it all down to identifying 17 attributes that he believes create a positive and engaging employee experience. And those companies that achieve this successfully, he calls experiential organizations. So I'll come back to that later. But the key point about the book is that he says we have to identify a reason for being in the organization and then have a look at these three environments, which he terms the physical, the technological, and the cultural environments. And if we can get that right, then we are likely to have more success. So actually referring to your point, Nandipha, about people feeling connected, that's very closely aligned to this notion of a reason for being. And then the 17 attributes he's divided nicely into a framework, neatly into a framework, where he talks about ACE technology, cool physical spaces, and a celebrated culture. So that's the framework for this. Now, I'm going to come back to this in some depth, but essentially he's saying reason for being in the middle, and then we've got 3 of the 17 attributes that refer to the technological environment, 4 that refer to the physical environment, and 10 that refer to the celebrated cultural environment. But I'll definitely take you through that in a bit more detail in a minute. So what's driving this? I mean, why is this important or why is this interesting? He wrote a previous book called The Future of Work, where he argues that mobility and changing demographics and globalization and so on are changing the nature of work. But he further, in this text, suggests that issues around the war for talent, technology, people analytics, the gig economy, and the fact that organizations are not having a great deal of success with engagement. That is actually a key stimulus for exploring whether we've got this topic nailed down. Some of you may have seen this image before, but typically when you think about engagement, the argument goes that of the 10 people working in an organization, 2 or 3 are actively engaged, 2 are trying to destroy the organization, and 5 or 6 are just looking at the view. So if they're rowing a boat, it's a reasonably simple image to have in your mind. But what the research is showing us now is that the 3 rowers are now down to 13% of the organization. So the Gallup surveys used to reveal 19% of the world generally engaged at work. Now it's down to 13%, which definitely suggests that we don't have sufficient people that are engaged. You've probably heard of the term presenteeism. People are at work, they show up, they do what they have to do, but they're not really, really engaged. So this is what prompts a lot of this research. Furthermore, engagement has become the new annual review. Now, this is definitely true because I've tested this anecdotally in our classes here. I recently had a class of execs on one of the programs from multiple companies, and I put this point to them. And quite a few agreed that yes, we all trudge through the engagement survey every year, They're very, very long, sometimes up to 100 questions. And one of the organizations represented in the room actually links your response to the engagement survey to your salary review. Now, you can be sure that you're not getting reliable data if that's what you're doing with your engagement survey. So he makes the point that, chucking a few beanbags down and a pool table, which is often seen as sort of an adrenaline shot to create a cool environment, is just, it's not the answer. I thought you might have seen this clip that went viral last month. What we're looking for is discretionary effort. Discretionary effort is the person who goes beyond what they have to do. And this guy at Lanseria Airport got his 15 minutes of fame. He made it onto CNN News because he is so careful about arranging this luggage so that people can get the handles facing outwards. This is an engaged individual that is displaying discretionary effort. In fact, if you Google YouTube on this, you'll see that he is held up as a brand ambassador for South Africa because this is how we handle baggage in South Africa versus Manchester Airport, where they just toss the bags onto one side. So I'm very proud of him, and I thought I had to just show you what discretionary effort looks like in practice. I think we all know that there's a worldwide war for talent. This is a well-known phrase. But what I found an interesting term in the book that I hadn't thought of before, but I really like it. He talks about the skills gap that I think we all know about. Certainly in our economy, structurally, there's a problem around what skills we're producing and what skills the economy needs. But he highlights for us the term skills uncertainty. And this is the fact that we're going into constantly this VUCA world we all talk about, volatile, uncertain. We don't really know what skills we need for the future. So in addition to there being a gap, we're not entirely sure what we should be training people for. And of course, the term millennials and how millennials are going to dominate our workspace, it is perfectly true that multiple generations have worked together for many, many years, many decades. The difference with this statistic now is that by 2025, 75% of the population will be in one particular demographic. And that instantly shifts the ratio and the balance and therefore the expectations of that particular group. If you are between the ages of 22 and 36 now, this year, then you are regarded as a millennial. So, that group is going to have far more voice in the workplace in the very near future. Alternative work arrangements have been around for a while. And they speak to the issue of us not all working full time. We talk about the gig economy, which is suggesting that people will work for a period of time and then not work for a period of time and take on another job. So if that's true, why should we worry about employee experience? Because everyone's this transitory demographic or transitory group that are working through the organization. But the truth is that it's not dominating our workspace yet, nowhere near. In fact, employee tenure has not really changed that much in a lot of the research. And according to Jacob Morgan, half the gig economy is driving an Uber. So when we talk about people that are working and not working, a large number of them are actually driving Ubers. But if you think about our country, you only have to stop at a traffic light to see somebody with a paintbrush or a spirit level hoping to sell their labor for a day to understand that the gig economy has actually been alive and well here for a very, very long time. So I think we have to always take some of these terms and consider in our context what that looks like. This is a key point of the book, that we are required to gather reliable data and analyze it before we make decisions. So it's not just a random few questions that we ask. And actually, this is the core foundation for employee experience, that you gather data about how people are engaging with their work environment, what they're doing, and how they're using the workspace in order to improve their whole experience. And HR is following marketing in this regard. Marketing has engaged in analytics for quite some time, looking at customer satisfaction, customer data, how people relate to products and so on. That's been around for a while. So HR is playing catch up in that regard. I'd also asked this question of our students recently, just, what kind of things are you measuring in respect of people in your organization? And typically the answers were, we do lots of measurement. We measure absenteeism, labor turnover, grievances, customer complaints. We measure time to hire, to fill a vacancy. But if you think about it, all of that is reactive data. So it's constantly looking at what people have done and focusing quite often on the negative, whereas this notion of people analytics is about proactive data. What data are we gathering in order to consciously shape the environment in order to retain people? And that data may be organizational, individual, or psychological. So a couple of examples that he cites. IBM introduced a concept called blue matching, where they actively invite people to apply for internal vacancies by matching the profile of people that are already working for them with the vacancy that's arisen, and sort of soliciting internal applications. And that has reduced labor turnover by 2%. LinkedIn created a heat map using certain data points like how long people have been there, salary, and so on, to identify who might be at risk of leaving. So, where are we potentially going to lose talent that we need? PwC found that they were recruiting graduates who were scoring the highest scores at the university, and they weren't necessarily doing the best once they got to the organization. So they redirected their recruitment efforts in that regard. And then, of course, there are other organizations like Cisco that have greatly reduced the engagement survey, in the number of questions, just short, sharp, and direct. There's a dark side to all of this, which we have to recognize, and that is that, if you're gathering all this data about people, you could potentially use it to manipulate them or to influence them in some negative way. So as with all of these things, there is a balance required around what we do with it, what we do with the data, and how do we handle it ethically. The other big push for why employee engagement is so important and employee experience is this notion of transparency, and particularly with social media, people can tweet very quickly, as I know you're all doing now, about the experience, about what it's like to work for an organization. So some of you may have come across the website Glassdoor, where people tell about their work experience, what it's like to work in that company. And sometimes they say quite negative things and sometimes quite positive. So I thought you might like this 2-minute clip. This is about Unilever. And what they did is they decided to proactively use Glassdoor to respond to what people are saying about working for their organization.
Hi guys, we are Marta from Italy, Guy from England, and Marta from Spain on the Unilever Future Leaders program. And we are here to talk a bit about the reviews on Glassdoor. So new review here, our performance management not very transparent.
I have performance management reviews every 6 months, so every time I rotate on the graduate scheme. I have them both with my line manager and my career sponsor.
It's always encouraged to be a two-way conversation as well.
Absolutely, yeah. The variety of career trajectories, if you're proactive about it, you can land where you want.
I like it very much because I really think this company is about networking. You can really make your path if you try to get along with the people.
You have your individual development plan so that you can sit down with your career sponsor, talk about your long-term career goals, and then you can work back from that. You can look at placements that would suit that career path that you want for yourself. Amazing offices, incredible staff shop.
It's very cool that we have a shop inside the office. You don't have to go to groceries after work because you have groceries.
Have you seen the office in Durban, South Africa? It is literally on the beach with...
Wow.
Yeah, and people there on their lunch break go surfing. Free ice cream.
Yeah.
Possibly a can if you're trying to stay in shape, but yeah.
Sorry, can we repeat that one?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that's an example of how an organization proactively used Glassdoor to promote their brand. And apart from this book, I can tell you that a lot of the research on millennials says that the opportunities to grow and learn and advance the career is their number one priority for them. So getting back to Jacob Morgan and his model, and referring particularly to your point, Nandipha, about a sense of connection. He says that the starting point for creating a very positive employee experience is that the organization needs to have a reason for being. Now, we've heard this before. If you think about Simon Sinek, he talks about the why and the golden circle, and organizations talk about a vision very often. So it's not an entirely new notion, but what he does suggest is that we think very carefully and I'm inviting you to do this right now, in your organization, what would be the short phrase that you would use to explain to people why your organization exists? What would be the short few words that would be able to convey very clearly why your organization exists? And it's not about making money. It's not to make money. If your organization exists to deliver some kind of service or product to people, you may well make money as a consequence. But you don't set yourself up in order to make money. It is often something slightly unattainable. It's a bit visionary. It's a bit of a dream. But it rallies people. It galvanizes them. It makes them want to feel connected. So a couple of examples from the book. Airbnb, their reason for being is to belong anywhere. For Coca-Cola, to refresh the world. For Google, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And he says that that's partly why people feel so connected to those organizations, particularly the last one, because it's almost got a moral purpose as opposed to a business purpose. So that's the first and key point about creating an employee experience, that you identify the reason for being and communicate it, obviously, so that everybody can relate to it. Then there's 17 variables or attributes that he has organized into 3 particular environments, provide us with the cultural, the physical, and the technological environment. And of the 252 companies in the study, only 15 got that right on all 17 variables. So what do those environments look like in a little more detail? I'm going back now to that framework I gave you earlier. The first one is the physical environment, where we're talking specifically about the space that people occupy. And in order to find out more about how to assess this, there are 4 particular questions or issues that you need to look at. I've inserted a link at the end of this presentation for you to go and log on, and for free you can assess how your company is doing against these particular attributes, but we'll get to that. So the 4 questions to consider with respect to the physical environment is, what does the space look like, the workspace? So you find out about this by actually watching where people go and how they work together. What do they use the space for? So the physical space, the offices, the meeting rooms, the relaxation spaces. Does the physical space reflect the values of the organization? Now that's quite an interesting one, and that's actually come up many times before. Even Edgar Schein's work way back in the 1970s, 80s, he talks about how the values of the organization are often reflected in the artifacts on the walls and so on. If you come into this business school and you think about reception, the things that we value are up on the walls, the international accreditations. That's what's important to this organization and what we value, so we highlight it. So think about your own organization. I mean, if you are saying that one of our values is collaboration, which is a common one that you find, then is everybody occupying little cubicles, or are they physically able to collaborate? If you say that your organization is customer-centric, how difficult is it for a customer to get into your organization? What do they go through security and at reception, and how welcoming are they at the gate? Those are the sorts of things that perhaps you could think about. Thirdly, do your staff feel proud to bring a visitor or relative or a friend on a tour? And do you offer flexible work options, which is obviously dependent on the nature of the work, but it's also part of what he says creates cool spaces. So for each of these 3 environments, he has come up with an acronym, chooses to bring in offers flexibility and so on. So he talks about cool office spaces, if you can address those 4 particular attributes. The second one of these environments that also contributes, I should say, 30% to employee experience is the technological environment. And here we're talking about devices, but also software and processes. So the 3 questions that create an ACE environment. Firstly, the technology that you buy and that you give your staff to use, is it enterprise grade or is it consumer grade? In other words, is it the kind of technology that they would use at home if they were given the opportunity, if they could buy for themselves? Or is it sort of second rate? Is it available to everybody? He says one should default to as many people having access to the technology as possible. A lot of organizations use technology to stratify status. hierarchy. So managers get this type of phone, and then employees get access to this. And that is directly contrary to what we are arguing for here. And then finally, does the technology focus on the needs of the employee rather than the organization? By that, he means the way they need to use it. I'll give you an example. I was talking to an administrator recently, and she has a lot of admin work to do, including issuing many invoices. And she said to me, do you know I have to do 38 clicks on my mouse to issue one invoice? So for her, her work experience is hugely frustrating because the technology and the system is not set up to make it a free-flowing and positive environment. So when you put those three things together, you get ACE technology, which is accessible, consumer grade, and focused on employee needs. And then the third of these environments is the cultural environment. And this is where I must say, I think I've heard a lot of this before. And you will have heard this around employee engagement. There's not a lot that's new here. But it's very, very important, contributes 40% to the employee experience. And it speaks to issues of leadership style and how people feel valued and how we make connections to the work and so on. And here he's got 10 variables or 10 attributes. So again, the sense of purpose, people are treated fairly, people feel valued, their managers are coaches and mentors, you feel like you're part of a team. There's research that shows that people who feel that they are part of a team will spend up to 48% more time engaged in the activity than people that say, oh, just give up because it's just me on my own. They would recommend others to come and work for the organization. Diversity and inclusion is a huge issue around, do people feel genuinely valued and do they feel psychologically safe in the organization to be different and diverse in the way they think and the way they engage. And then talking about employees' well-being, which is not just paying for gym memberships. It's also psychological well-being and emotional well-being. And then if you put all those variables together, he comes up with celebrated culture, and that's his acronym for the 10 elements in that particular part of the model. But what's important about this is that they don't operate independently. So if one takes a systemic view of all of this, you need to think about the physical, the technological, and the cultural environment as working together. And that's why it's important that we multiply the environments to get the overall employee experience and not just add them. So that's a key part of the book, and that takes us through parts 1 and part 2, essentially. So I'm going to move on now to the business case, some of the data that he gathered there, and then also what you can do and how this applies to our organizations. When he analyzed the data from the 252 companies, he thought that he was going to do the classic consultant thing and have a quadrant. You know how you have the two axes and you cross them, and all consultants have quadrants. But he found then that it was more complex than that. So he ended up with a continuum. And he has neatly categorized the patterns that he found into 9 employee experience categories, which range from inexperienced at the one extreme end to experiential at the other extreme end. So you can see from this particular diagram, it's quite easy to follow, that organizations that are not doing a great deal in any of the 3 environments would be regarded as inexperienced. Organizations that are either technologically, physically, or culturally emergent are focusing on one of the 3 experiences. Organizations that are either enabled, empowered, or engaged are focusing on 2 of the 3. Pre-experiential organizations are doing pretty well on all 3 categories, or all 3 experiences. And then only, as he says, 15 of the 252 organizations are actually experiential. So he's saying pre-experiential organizations are doing pretty well, but if people got the chance, they'd leap to the experiential. In this next slide, what I've done is I've actually just inserted the percentages from his research against each of these categories. So you can see that a fifth were in the inexperienced section. But what is interesting about this data, if you look at the first 4 categories, so inexperienced and only focusing on one of the environments, that's 49% of the organization. So nearly half are in the, let's say, not so successful section. But this is an interesting stat. 20% of organizations were culturally emergent, and that's where people are focusing on employee engagement. So all those points you made about the cultural environment, they focus very much on employee engagement. But to take this one step further now, we're talking about the technological and the physical environment as well as complementing and working together with the cultural. Okay, so that was an interesting interpretation of that. How did he make a business case for it? What did he do to convince people that there is actually an argument for improving employee experience that will positively impact the bottom line? He used 4 data sources. Firstly, the anecdotal evidence that he got from executives. So in all his interviews, he was comparing the kinds of information people were giving him with what are perceived to be successful companies. So that's kind of gut feel. That's just, educated assessment. But then he also went and quite systematically went through lots of lists and rankings, the customer satisfaction index, how organizations are ranked in America around customer service ratings, what's the most innovative company, the most admired company, the most respected company, all those assessments that get done regularly. So he gathered that data. And then he also looked at the metrics like labor turnover, profit, employee growth and so on, and then the share price, what will they call the stock price, we call the share price. So he used quite rigorous data in order to argue for where there were successful companies and with positive employee experiences. I should say at this point that there are a couple of examples in the book of companies that are highly successful that do quite poorly on the EE index. And he makes no apology for naming some of them. I mean, Berkshire Hathaway, we all know is a highly successful company, doesn't do very well when you look at feeling like part of a team or inclusive and diverse workforce. And he has no problem naming those organizations. So just to summarize where we are at the moment in this talk, reason for being, 3 environments that are important. They would contribute to employee engagement via the business value that is derived from creating a positive employee experience. And the business value is on the extreme right of that diagram. So the 252 global organizations were in the research, as I've said. These are the 15 companies that were in the top 6%. And if you look at them, your instinctive reaction might be, oh yes, they're all techie companies. That was my reaction. And yes, that's true. But then I went and I looked up which were some of the companies in the pre-experiential category, which is the one just below this, also doing pretty well. And there he's got Johnson & Johnson, Red Bull, American Express, 3M, Deloitte, Procter & Gamble, PwC, Nike, St. Jude's Research Hospital, Goldman Sachs, Starbucks, Nationwide Mutual Insurance. So I mention that because they're not all exclusively tech companies that are doing pretty well in taking this quite seriously. He gives a lot of data, which I'm not going to go into now, about the percentage or the factor by which growth, pay, profit, and so on are increased in organizations that take the employee experience very seriously. But the short version of all of that, from around chapter 11 of the book, is that experiential organizations have higher customer satisfaction ratings generally, top-notch innovation practices. They're the most attractive and respected places to work. They're the most valuable brands in terms of measuring the brand equity. They're smarter, greener, happier, and more diverse. And they have the best people and teams working for them. And they actually have higher ROI, which is assessed through the stock price. So some of you might be wondering, okay, this all sounds great, so how much is this going to cost? I mean, that thought definitely went through my mind. And yes, there is some cost involved. There definitely is. He makes the point that organizations that are starting up from scratch will find it a lot easier to design an employee experience that is enriching and positive, whereas more slow-moving established organizations might take longer to change things. However, there is only some cost involved in improving your technology and making it more accessible, but it's absolutely free to go around and see how people are using the processes and the technology and where the frustrations are, and showing that there's a genuine concern around how people engage with processes and technology. There's some cost for redesigning physical spaces, but it's absolutely free to welcome visitors or the public in for a tour, because that's how you create a relationship with people when you're not looking for staff. They remember positively about your organization. Open plan is actually cheaper than offices, where you're talking about, square meterage or rental space. And it's absolutely free to make people feel part of a team or valued, or to encourage and ensure diversity when hiring or behaving ethically. So I think there is some cost involved, but it doesn't. No one's asking you to knock down all the walls, physical walls. We're suggesting that taking it seriously is actually free. And the other point I've put in the corner actually to remind me to say is that not everything is free at Google. We get these videos go around, these little clips around, oh, how amazing it is to work there, and you get 3 meals a day. By the way, 3 meals a day is a clue as to how many hours you're spending at work. But anyway, I digress. The point he makes about Google is that it's not all free. A lot of the things that are offered as services there, people actually pay for. But an organization has the clout to negotiate reduced rates for things, which staff might then be able to get access to, as its benefits. It's not difficult for an organization to approach somebody about setting up a car wash in the car park, for which people will then pay for their cars to be washed, if that's something that's important or interesting, or not interesting, worthwhile to your staff, sorry. So how does this all work? This slide is actually one slide that represents quite a significant chunk of the book. The point is, you can't sit here and say, okay, these are the 17 things like a checklist that we have to go and do, because those 17 things will change over time. It's about saying, if we truly care about the employee experience, how do we engage with people to find out what is meaningful? And that is, as I've said here, an ongoing dance of conscious and purposeful efforts. And it's based on data, design, and it's designed with staff, not for staff. So it's a dance that weaves. So it starts with responding, genuinely trying to find out what people do or want or how they experience the organization, how you analyze that data, and for that you need teams of analysts, how you then co-design solutions or experiences, launch them, and then invite people to participate through a very comprehensive communication strategy and process, and then keep on asking, analyzing, designing, launching, and participating as time goes by. So here's a couple of examples. General Electric created FastWorks, a methodology to launch new products, which they then transferred to the employee experience. Airbnb uses food quite consciously to encourage people to share and to network. And so they analyze what people order, and they analyze the menus, and they co-create new menus based on, more vegetarian food is being ordered this week and so on. Google makes as much information as possible available to everybody, from quite junior software engineers from day one. And Cisco talk about the people deal. And here they talk about moments of magic, or moments that matter, which is replaced the employee life cycle. So, for example, you remember your first day at work in your current organization. That would be a moment that matters. So what do we do around that? You remember your first promotion. You remember when something difficult was going on in your life personally and how the organization responded. So they argue that the employee life cycle has moved away from this traditional, hire and then eventually retire, and focuses more on moments that matter, and that we connect very strongly with whatever experiences we had at that time in our lives. And so you've got your reason for being, your employee experiences, your 17 variables, and moments that matter. They may be specific, ongoing, or consciously created by the organization. He goes into some depth around that. So who owns the employee experience? It has to be initiated at the top. It's like many of these things. It can be championed by everybody, even managers can drive it, but it has to be a true commitment from the top. And that, in my experience, means it must be measured at the top. It must be aligned to how execs are measured and rewarded. So what can you do? Well, first of all, you have to really care. You can't just pay lip service to this and say, oh, it's really important, buy a few bean bags, as I've said, and put in a pool table. You have to really, really care about how people are engaging with your organization and experiencing working there. And start off by defining a reason for being. So that short, sharp phrase that I spoke about earlier. It might not be the HR team that does this. In fact, there's a strong argument that you can't expect HR to be responsible for every single thing that happens to people in the organization. So the payroll and the performance management system and so on might not necessarily be located in the same physical structure as the employee experience officer. You're going to need a lot of technology, not necessarily expensive technology, but apps and applications that have been designed specifically to gather data, gather information. And then you will have more chance of implementing the cool spaces and the ACE technology and the celebrated culture. So how do you create cool spaces? Think about your physical environment as an employee center rather than an office. Invite people to visit, to go on tours. Introduce workplace flexibility, but at the same time, you have to couple that with measurable outcomes. This is not a free-for-all. And think beyond open and closed spaces. Don't just think open plan. Think about where do people collaborate? Can they sit at home and work? Is there an opportunity for them to meet at a coffee shop somewhere else if that happens to suit what they need? What can you do about technology? Try as possible to default to giving people access. Everybody gets access. Don't stratify it according to rank or hierarchy. Avoid long rollouts of things. Organizations are great at introducing something new, and then we're going to roll it out. 2 years later, it's rolled out, the technology's moved on, the whole process is no longer functional. You know what I'm talking about. So it's got to be really short, it's got to be just in time, it's got to be now and quickly for everybody. Start the HR-IT partnership conversation, because it's people that use technology, and we have to be very careful about which tail is wagging which dog here. And then the culture, many of the things you probably are doing already, particularly if you're focusing on engagement, but go on to Glassdoor and just see what people say about working for you. I had someone in my class that was from a very respected firm, and she went on and had a look. She was horrified at what was being put out there publicly, and the company was doing nothing to mitigate that particular information. If you're going to ask for input from people, then use it. There's nothing more patronizing than running around getting information from everyone and then just ignoring it, or the executive making his own decision. Try and create a line of sight for people. How is what I do related to the aim of this organization? And I'll give you a quick example from one of my classes here. We had a quite senior staff member from the state health department here, and she was saying that they had a huge problem with stockouts of medicine in the public health system, and we know there are challenges there. So she took her staff that were dealing with the stockouts to Khayelitsha Day Hospital to actually see what the impact is if you don't have medicines available. Because it's a surprising number of people in head office have a total disconnect with what's happening on the ground when their actions they don't truly understand their reason for being. And she found there was quite a big improvement in people's commitment to ensuring that the stock was available. So lots of things about making people feel appreciated and valued. If you're going to value teamwork, then for goodness sake, reward it as people as a team. Can't say teamwork's important, put them in individual cubicles and then reward them individually, and then expect them to work as a team. It's just counterintuitive. Learning and development. One of the organizations in the book has a 24 for You program, where you have 24 hours where you can go and develop yourself in anything that interests you. And very often that links back to community work or some kind of skill that people want to learn, and the company pays for it. So once a year you get a 24 for You development opportunity. And everyone must be treated fairly, but not necessarily the same. And by that I mean people must perceive that they are treated equitably, but we all have different needs. We're quite unique, so we don't get treated the same. We don't get given the same benefits necessarily, because we need to think about what works for us. Identify some personalized moments that matter. This is the Cisco model for that, which is printed in the book. It's available on Google as well. You can just enter that and it's easy to find. These are the 11 moments that matter in the experience of someone working in that organization. And then, think of your workplace as a lab, not a factory, where you can experiment and test things out. And if they don't necessarily work, it's okay to ditch that idea and go for something else. We don't have to get it right 100% first time. I thought this might be a good way to end. This is a new benefit that's been offered in some organizations. It might work for you, it might not. Just a word of caution about that. The University of KZN has introduced a day's leave now where you can mourn the passing of your pet. But it only applies to dogs and cats, and apparently the lawyers are jumping onto this and saying, well, what about people have an affinity to their little pet reptile and hamster and so on, so be careful. It doesn't work for everyone. But yeah, in summary, an interesting read, some new refreshing thoughts, some things we've heard before recycled, but put in a very nice framework, which I don't think we've found before. So I hope you found it useful, and thanks very much for coming to listen.